Bueno, pues muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros para darle la bienvenida a Rob Bennett en esta conferencia magistral. Rob ya ha estado con nosotros en otras ocasiones y me da mucho gusto que haga el esfuerzo de venir con nosotros. Quisiera presentarlo de manera pues muy formal. Es el director ejecutivo y fundador del Portland Sustainability Institute. Viene de la Clinton Climate Initiative, donde fue gerente de políticas de ciudades y habitacional, desarrollando programas piloto habitacionales para las ciudades de Houston y de Chicago. En ese puesto, Rob también prestó asistencia técnica a ciudades en América del Norte en las áreas de reducción de cambio climático y políticas de gestión de edificios. Antes de eso, pasó 8 años trabajando directamente para las ciudades de Vancouver y Portland. Dirigió el desarrollo de la estrategia de edificaciones verdes de Vancouver y facilitó las actividades de infraestructuras y edificación verde para la regeneración del sudeste Falls Creek, mejor conocido como la Villa Olímpica 2010. En Portland, Rob fundó el Cities Green Building Program y dirigió el programa de conservación y política de desarrollo en las áreas de eficiencia energética y sustentabilidad corporativa. Rob se graduó en la Universidad de Massachusetts en la Amherst School of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. Ha participado en las mesas directivas de la Cascadia Region Green City Council y de Rich Community Development. Thank you, Rob, for coming, and thank you for being with us tonight. And I leave them in very good hands.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back again. I was here last year this time, so thank you for having me again. I'm looking forward to tonight and to tomorrow when we're going to do a workshop on eco-districts, one of our efforts that I'm going to do. Tonight we have a long time together, and hopefully we can spend some time talking between us, as I'm interested in hearing as much about development and sort of the Green Cities movement here in Mexico City. I spent a day today and yesterday with some urban design professionals and meeting with the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing. And so I got a little bit more of an orientation to some of the activities here in Mexico City. And what I'm going to do for the next couple hours is talk through, from my perspective, of course I have a U.S.-centric perspective, although I have worked overseas a bit. But I talk a little bit about the trends and the activities that I see as important for the Green Cities movement, which I think is universal, and it's happening here in Mexico City. It's happening in most cities around the world. My organization is a small nonprofit that was founded by our current mayor, Sam Adams, in 2009. The intent of our organization was to be an intermediary or a sort of a catalyst glue-making organization between the public sector, the private sector, and higher ed and academia. The idea is that we need to generate more strategy and more catalytic projects in sustainability more quickly, and we need to make sure that the business community and the private sector and higher ed are doing this together. So we've got this idea of does this have a pointer? This idea of our projects starting as research projects, moving into implementation phase. And the idea is this sort of notion of a sandbox or a test lab for strategies, and then ultimately trying to export and create a learning network around the work that we do. It's important that we look at high impact projects, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our eco-districts program, because that's probably our most significant effort today. So I think this is critical to frame the conversation tonight. How we live in cities is one of the greatest challenges of our times. I think no one knows that more than you all, living amongst 20 million plus in Mexico City. Our cities can either be tremendous places to live or horribly, places that are very bad places to live and really sort of take the life and the sort of heart and soul out of our people, or they can lift us up. And I think the way that urbanization trends are going today, we've got to figure this out as urban developers, as architects, as urban planners. We have to figure it out very quickly, and we need new tools because our sort of institutions today aren't prepared for the growth that's happening. Our vision around green cities includes one of three different sort of major components. One, we think we can create smart practices that lead to green cities everywhere. So we're actually part of a small fraternity, if you will, of cities that are trying to figure out how to make more livable places, reduce carbon emissions, reduce air pollution, protect our water resources, and protect and enhance health and human safety of our communities. We also are committed to this notion that you can grow the economy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is, particularly in the U.S. context, where politically greenhouse gas emissions is a non-starter. It's been incredibly divisive politically. We haven't, very embarrassingly, we haven't signed on to even modest efforts, including the Kyoto Protocol. So in the U.S., this notion that greenhouse gas emissions will destroy the economy has constantly been an issue that we face. And all the literature, all the research shows otherwise, that the cities that are most efficient, the cities that are most compact, the cities that are most diverse actually have reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and they live more. And then we also think that we can develop a new engine for our region that takes advantage of Portland's particular role in the sustainability movement. Portland's got a long history of doing sustainability-related work. We've got a reputation for being a sustainability center, and we want to be able to generate new economic activity because of that work. And probably most importantly, I just touched on this, but is that the greatest barriers to actually implementing sustainability don't lie in the technological solutions or nor the culture. It's really institutional. And I was learning a little bit today around the sort of multiple layers of Mexico City governance and the political dimensions here. That's the problem. That's the problem in Mexico City. I'm sure it's a problem where I come from. The ability to actually institutionalize projects and create public-private partnerships are usually thwarted by political dimensions. And the ability to work at scale is also thwarted by political dimensions. So the reality is concern plus best practice plus institutional capacity leads to action. If you don't have institutional capacity, then you don't have action. And probably the two statistics or the two drivers for change that we care about most is the global acceleration of living in cities. Globally, we just passed 50% of the world's population living in cities. In the U.S., it's close to 82%. So in contrast to sort of popular mythology in our country about us being an agrarian society, we're mostly an urban society. And actually, most of that urban society in our country is suburban society. And it's created a really strange political dimension, and it's created a lot of problems for us. We've basically invested in the wrong kind of development over 50 years, and now we're paying the price, and we have to figure out how to repurpose our cities so that they're more functional. And this other issue of greenhouse gas emissions, because global warming will more quickly alter the landscape that we live in, whether it's disease vectors or flooding, whether it's agricultural capacity in your region, whether it's climate migration patterns from climate refugees. Climate change is going to be the most significant driver along with urbanization that we're going to face. And so our cities are going to be at the center of all this activity. We're more urban, and greenhouse gas emission activities and emissions are concentrated in the cities. So we got to get these things sorted out, and have to sort them out fairly quickly. And look at the trends in sort of global cities movement. It's rapid change, and it's not looking too good. This is China, where 3 years ago they had 3/4 of the world's construction cranes. They were generating more, using more concrete than the rest of the world combined. Incredible rapid urbanization in China and other places. Rapid expansion of roadways in China and other places that traditionally had better multimodal infrastructure. They were destroying a lot of the infrastructure. It's happening here as well. It's happening in the U.S. and it's been replaced by a very expensive infrastructure dedicated to single occupancy vehicles mostly. And this could be Santa Fe. this could be my city. This is a very expensive piece of infrastructure working very inefficient. If you think about it, all of these people are stuck in traffic. They're in expensive cars. They're going nowhere fast, and they're polluting the hell out of our cities. And so, as a function of good city making, our transportation networks that we built are some of the worst sort of thinking from a resiliency and adaptability perspective. This is an image that we saw today in Mexico City, some of the housing here in the outskirts of the city. I come from a fairly small city of 2 million people. This is a stunning amount of new change. But this is, again, not consistent with a lot of the high-growth cities in the world. The amount of energy it takes to sort of fuel all of our cities is extraordinary. And the mix of energy often for every city, it's a little different. From where I come from, it's a high percentage of hydro, natural gas, and coal. Other parts of the world are predominantly, reliant on coal. And of course, that not only it creates more air pollution, it creates sort of less resiliency in the energy system as a whole. So this is the trends of cities, and the trends aren't very good. Increasing amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, rapidly moving towards 380 parts per million, up from 350 parts per million that the scientists all agree is about the tipping point. We get over 420, and we're all hell breaks loose on the planet. So the system the ability to monitor and sort of be able to handle the amount of emissions that we're producing. So that's the backdrop, and I wanted to talk a little bit about where I come from to set the context, and hopefully there's some universal sort of ideas that I'll talk about tonight. So any of you know where Portland is? If the map wasn't up, do you know where Portland, Oregon in the U.S. is? Raise your hands. We're a very small city in the context of the U.S., so I'm not offended that you don't know where I come from. But Portland is in the United States. It is in the northwest corner of the United States, one of the last to be populated, and some of the sort of newest development in the U.S. is in our region. It's part of the sort of Intermountain West that's made up of mountains, valleys, and high desert. If we zoom in a little closer, this is the Canadian-U.S. border. This is Oregon. This is Portland right there. It's a very fertile growing valley, but in the context of a lot of land, much of this is quite empty. This is high desert ranch lands, very empty, hardly any population. Seattle is here, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada is here. But it's one of the most beautiful places in the U.S. There's different ecotones and ecosystems. There's the coast, there's coastal mountain ranges, there's valleys, there's volcanic, part of the Pacific Rim volcanic sort of range in which you all are as well. So we've got active volcanoes in the region, again, high desert, and then sort of mountain ranges throughout. We get about 30 inches of rain every year. We have a drought cycle in the summer, and our rainy season goes from November to May. We actually, even though we get a fair amount of rain, particularly a lot more in the coastal range, we get upwards of 200 inches of rain, and we're part of a coastal rainforest that's one of the few large-scale coastal rainforests left in the world. We like to consider ourselves part of Cascadia. Cascadia is a term for the region, the bioregion in which we live. This map shows the Cascadia region, which is the watersheds of the region that flow to the Pacific Ocean, and in which Portland is in the middle of it. This is also a delineation of salmon habitat that's unique to our region. So we think of ourselves not only as a city, but we think of ourselves in the context of watersheds and habitat, and that's been part of the culture of our region for a long time. We have very dense old-growth forests. This is Portland. It's a river city, and this is a view just outside of Portland. So that's Mount Hood, so one of our volcanic peaks. Very lush, very productive agricultural place in the United States. We also have a sort of a series of sort of cultural sort of activities and trends coming together. We have the largest that really are impact kind of how we think and do our work in Portland. We're the largest center for apparel and outdoor gear in the United States. Nike is headquartered in Portland. As you know, Nike is a Portland company. Intel is also another Portland company. So we have the largest cluster of apparel and outdoors. We're a very outdoor city, lots of races, running, bicycle, cyclocross. There's just a very large culture of outdoor activity, hiking, fishing, backpacking, that skiing, that kind of thing. We're also a center of bike culture for the U.S. So, and I'll show a film at the end of the day, but we basically have a $90 million industry around bikes in Portland. It started very modestly with just building some bike lanes, but it created a subculture of bike usage, of ultimately bicycle manufacturing and some service industries that are associated with bicycling. So whenever you think about sustainability and cycling in particular, it used to be a wacky idea that people would commute around the city by bicycle. We just a recent report that was issued by ERA that studied the 40 largest cities, and Mexico City is part of the C40, if you've heard of it, a consortium of 40 largest cities globally that are working together on climate change. And they issued the report at the last C40 meeting where all the mayors from these 40 cities came together in Sao Paulo. And the biggest amount of projects in the last 3 years that cities are undertaking globally is around cycling infrastructure. So this is not some niche activity. Mexico City is also being very active in this area of bike sharing. This becomes a fundamental part of your active transportation system. And if you design it right, it becomes part of your economic development strategy for the city as well, as it has in Portland. We've become a center in the U.S. for slow food and local agriculture, and then the sort of industries that create restaurants and grocery stores that emphasize organic, locally produced food. Again, another strange kind of outlier activity led by a bunch of entrepreneurs and environmental advocates many years ago is now translated into a very sophisticated food-centric industry of food producers, restaurants, grocery stores. A large concentration of innovation around food happens in the Pacific Northwest in California, and it's created a tremendous sort of tourism opportunity for us in the U.S. We're now the center of we have more breweries per capita than any other place in the world for beer, distilleries, wineries, and coffee roasting. So we're the center of U.S. coffee roasting now. That's something that's happened in the last 5 years. And again, some of you who've traveled to the U.S., 15 or 20 years ago, you wouldn't say there was much that the U.S. was producing of quality around food. We're not known for food in the U.S. Well, that's absolutely shifted in the last 20 years. And it's a very sophisticated marketplace in which small business, and driven mostly by small business by the way as well. So that's a big part of our work. And then we've got a very rich indie music scene in the Northwest. Of course, you've probably heard of Nirvana in Seattle and the grunge scene of the early 90s. Well, Portland is part of an emerging sort of arts and culture scene that's, for a city of our size, is quite important and creates, again, a sort of a sensibility of how we view ourselves and the work that we do. And finally, what we're going to talk about is we're also a center of green innovation. So in the U.S., we're viewed as kind of a wacky outlier city that started, managing its land use growth years ago and doing things like promoting smart growth and transportation infrastructure, green building, composting, recycling. A lot of that started over 40 years ago. Well, now it's become a huge economic differentiator for Portland. We have more LEED buildings than any other city in the U.S. per capita. We've got a very sophisticated development industry that does green building and exports its architecture, engineering, and development services around the world. So again, this is the notion of green being something that's a tack on or sort of a nice to do or a avant-garde cities does, it's fundamental to economic development for all of our cities, Mexico City included. We need every city to be thinking this way and making public investments and private investments so that the economic activities follow. And like most cities globally, it wasn't always this way. This is an image of Portland in 1960. This was it was a pretty mediocre city, a pretty grim place to be, highly polluted. Industry was fleeing for the suburbs. We were destroying very beautiful historic buildings and paving them over with parking lots because the downtown business interests thought the only way to save downtown was to create lots of cheap parking. So we didn't invest in our urban infrastructure. We invested in parking and highways. We created a highway that's along the river here. It was a highly industrial city with an emphasis on logging and minerals primarily. We took highway buildings to a whole new level. We destroyed which was a very rich for many years waterfront. And we were one of the largest. We were the largest city in the West Coast for quite some time. And then San Francisco during the gold, and Seattle during the California gold rush, and Seattle during the Alaska gold rush became the largest cities in the U.S. on the West Coast. But we were a major port for the West Coast, and those activities got replaced by highway building. So we destroyed our waterfront and we made a highway out of it. We destroyed our land and polluted it heavily. This is just industrial activities. We were one of the large centers for shipbuilding during World War II. We built about a ship a day out of the Kaiser shipyards during World War II, and this was sort of the result after the shipyards closed was just a tremendous amount of polluted land that was very expensive to redevelop. And we had an incredibly polluted river. We're a Superfund site, which is the designation in the U.S. for one of the worst polluted, one of the worst designations for pollution. We've got major water quality issues, or had major water quality issues, and we had an increasingly unlivable downtown. So it's a very common story throughout the U.S. and the world that as we built out, we didn't invest in green infrastructure, we didn't invest in sort of urban revitalization. We just sort of slashed and burned the city as the time went on. And then we built the suburbs. It's a little fuzzy, but this is typical suburban. This is the edge condition in which this is farmland, and this is just suburban sprawl, heading out to the suburbs. So a very different style in Mexico City. You guys are doing it more intensely, more densely, but same effect. You're just chewing up all kinds of very productive farmland. In our case, very productive farmland. Some of the best farmland and vineyards and farmland and other agricultural activities is in Portland and the surrounding areas. So we were destroying the very sort of economic engine that had been an important part of our economy. So about 40 years ago, it was pretty bad in Portland and a lot of U.S. cities. Suburbanization was on. The city was in very tough shape, and there was a bunch of very progressive leadership at the city. A young mayor who was 32 years old, Tim Goldschmidt. He went on to become the Secretary of Transportation under one of our presidents, Jimmy Carter, in the late 70s. He decided the way that we were going to save Portland was by protecting our land, by investing in transit, investing in downtown revitalization. It's a similar story if you study Curitiba. Portland and Curitiba are very similar in the sort of approaches they took to really emphasizing transportation and the land use connection. We started with a very important piece of legislation at our state called Senate Bill 100. That created the land use infrastructure and the land use laws that then became the sort of backbone of smart land use, smart growth, and our urban boundary. And policies have been created ever since. One of our latest is our green building strategy and our climate action plan. So these policies have been layering up over 40 years, but it really started with land use. And it started with the creation of an urban growth boundary. So this is Portland. It's about 200 square miles. There's 25 jurisdictions, 2.5 million people. The river, the Willamette River, runs through the heart of the city. This is downtown. The Columbia River, the second largest river in the country after the Mississippi, runs through one side of the city, and the state of Washington. So we're a metro region that's a bi-state region, which creates a lot of complexities on tax and other sort of bi-state policy making. We started with an urban growth boundary. Now this growth boundary was set up in 1979. It's been expanded 10 times over the years, very modestly. You can see these are the expansions over the years. The largest one coming about 3 years ago in Damascus, which is a very rich farming region. This is quite controversial. But even though we've expanded the urban growth boundary, and we have to do this every 5 years by law, look at the inventory of land that could be developed, look at the inventory of developable land, look at the trends for urbanization, and determine if we're going to expand the growth boundary or keep it the same. But regardless of the expansions, 85% of all development since 1979 has happened within the original urban development boundary. You contrast Portland to Phoenix, or some of our larger western cities that have grown and sprawled. If we grew like Phoenix and we didn't have an urban growth boundary, our development patterns would be out here. It would be about twice the amount of land for the same kind of densities that we have now in Portland. So the urban growth boundary has been tremendously important to keep our region compact and to sort of emphasize smart growth. We then, after the urban growth boundary, created what we call the 2040 strategy. This is a strategy to prioritize land use, planning, transportation infrastructure, natural areas protection, etc. So we created a typology of town centers, main street corridors, regional centers, all linked by a transportation infrastructure that we've built out over the years. And this is our guiding document, if you will, for the metro region. It's what we build towards. We have a regional government, the only one in the United States that has legislative authority for land use planning for the whole region and transportation infrastructure for the whole region. So we actually are legislative. Even the 25 jurisdictions are legislated over regional governments, which is very unique, and that creates one of the real advantages in our city, because that means that the cities that are fighting each other for growth, for jobs, for sprawl, they actually have to work together to identify what kind of land use plans they're going to put together, and it's going to have to be knit together by the regional government that then votes on and then ultimately adopts the investments. So you can't make an investment in a new highway or a new transit system over here without the other jurisdictions signing off. So it's probably some of the most rational planning in the U.S. in a country where this is like communism. You know, in our country, this kind of level of intense regional decision making, we couldn't adopt this today. The politics have changed in our state to the point where politically this is untenable. But we've got it in place. It works beautifully. Everybody goes along. But it's, you know, in the U.S. context, we hate government. You know, we hate regulatory authority. We like to consider ourselves just entrepreneur and just let the market figure it out. This is a very controlled land use planning strategy. It's probably more akin to what happens in Mexico and other countries in which you have a much stronger role for local and federal and state government to dictate policy. We created just recently an urban-rural land reserve. So one of the things that became evident as we built the urban growth boundary was the development industry wanted more certainty about the value of land going forward for a long period of time. And the farming interests and the forestry interests wanted that as well. The farming community does not want speculation on their land, because then farming becomes quite expensive. If you speculate on their land and you can eventually redevelop it for housing or for commercial activities or industrial activities, it makes it very expensive for the farmers to do their business. Their property taxes go up. So by holding an urban growth boundary and then dictating a 50-year plan for land, both urban, within urban, and without, in the rural areas. You're trying to create some level of stability in the housing markets. You're trying to create some stability in the real estate markets, and you're trying to just simply send very strong signals to the marketplace and to the cities where the development's going to happen, where it's not going to happen. So that was adopted as part of the urban growth boundary just last year. So this is a new wrinkle to our regional efforts. About 10 years ago, we also took a very rigorous look at habitat and natural areas. And so we did an ecological analysis of the whole metro region with ecologists and biologists and other scientists, and we mapped the most productive habitat left that was both privately held and public. So we wanted to understand the long-term sort of ecological functionality of the region to develop a land conservation strategy for natural areas. And so these areas that you see here became, are the sort of hotbeds, if you will, of ecological functionality. They're where habitat is. It's where there's multiple function habitat. There's species, in play. And so this sort of bubble maps became the long-term strategy for purchasing land and putting it into protection. And we've had 2 public bonds that were issued, voter approved, to buy about 8,000 acres. I'm sorry I haven't translated the hectares, and I'll do that before the night's over. But this has been a very important strategy to protect important habitat, not just the farmlands, but the edge conditions around farms, upslope conditions. And you can see in the distance a lot of logging over the years. That's Mount Hood. This is just outside of Portland. And so we're trying to protect our rural and our forestry activities. And then now we're turning ourselves inward. That was a lot of land use planning that happened 30, 35 years ago. It's only been in the last 15 years that we've really focused on urbanization in the city core. This is one of the more successful developments in Portland. It's an old rail yards. It's now a high-dense neighborhood of mixed-use, commercial housing, affordable housing. Social housing, we call it affordable housing. Some of it's publicly held affordable housing. This is an affordable housing project. This is a market rate housing project. This is a commercial building with a series of public parks, streetcar, and other sort of bicycle infrastructure. We've started to look at sort of urban habitat a little more carefully. This is a project that was designed by a famous ecologist from Germany, Herbert Dreiseidel, who does these wonderful biotope projects in which they're really looking at managing stormwater from a district, bringing it in and becoming an asset in a neighborhood park context. So all the stormwater from the buildings and the streets funnel into this park. There's a stream here that goes down. This is a wetland that goes dry in the dry season. It obviously fills up in the wet season. There's a bunch of sort of nesting species, ducks and birds that make this home. And then what you can't see is that there's sort of a pool here, what Herbert calls a biotope. It's cleansing. It's a system of cleansing sort of strategies and plans to cleanse the water that ultimately becomes a stormwater management strategy and a park all in one. We've tried to knit historic, our idea of history in Portland. The 1850s is the oldest building, so we're not the center of civilization like you are here in Mexico City. It goes back to 6,000 BC, but 1850 is our historic sort of building stock. But we're trying to knit new buildings into that historic stock. This is a successful project, one of the first green development projects of the 5-block infill project in Portland, mixed use. And we're slowly rebuilding those pictures I showed you of those shipyards that were highly polluted. We are now mitigating that. This is the largest brownfield redevelopment in the city's history. It's over 300 acres. When it's built out, it'll have about 15,000 residents and about 5,000 jobs and a series of parks and community centers and all of that. You can see, can see here, not very well, this was a highway. This was one of our early interventions. We tore down a highway and we built a park. That was that waterfront I showed you. It used to be very productive. Now it's what we call the front, the living, or it's the front porch of the city. It's a nice park that the downtown, a lot of the downtown workers enjoy during the day. So we identify mixing transportation. I mentioned transportation investment. Since 1990, we've tripled the amount of transit ridership in the city. We've built 64 miles of light rail and streetcar in the city. We were the first city in the U.S. to reintroduce streetcar. We were, like many cities in the U.S., we were a streetcar city back in the late 1800s. We had over 125 miles of streetcar in Portland, which rivaled Los Angeles and other cities. We tore it all apart. We built streets and roads, just like every other city. And so we're trying to now kind of re-knit the rail back into the urban framework of the city. We just opened this line to the suburbs, one of the suburbs. So we've got now 6 lines going out to the suburbs. We were the first city to do light rail in the U.S. back in 1985. There was a popular uprising against a proposed highway in the late 70s. That highway got stopped, and the federal government, because we had very strong local and congressional leadership, took those investments that were intended for the highway and allowed us to build that first light rail line that opened in 1986. We've now got 6 lines totaling, as I mentioned, 64 miles. So that first investment allowed us to build at a time in the U.S. when very little mass transit was being built. I mean, we're a country that has destroyed our mass transit infrastructure. In most cities, particularly in the West, where Portland's located, because of the low density nature of development over the last 40 years, it's very expensive to have transit. In transit, we don't have the kind of density in corridors that you have in Mexico City and other highly dense cities. So we've had to kind of knit together a mass transit strategy in a city that didn't have the densities, that had to sort of build it before the densities came, and that's quite unusual. Feel free to ask questions as I go out here, or make comments about Mexico City as well. And then streetcar. This is again, the first streetcar built in the U.S., modern streetcar. Was built in Portland, and now we manufacture it. And we were buying streetcars from the Czech Republic, and now we're the only U.S.-based manufacturer of streetcars. So we sort of created an economic development strategy that's not just about providing transit and transportation, but it also provides a new level of infrastructure that creates jobs. And so we build streetcars for other cities in the U.S. And it's really probably one of the sort of proudest sort of economic development stories that we have in the recent years. We introduced car sharing. We were the first city in the U.S. to bring car sharing, but ultimately Zipcar is the largest car sharing company in the world. They got their start, there's 2 companies. One company's got their start in Portland, the other, Zipcar, got its start in Boston, and Zipcar is now consolidated a major majority of car sharing companies in the world. There's a new idea coming called peer-to-peer car sharing. Has anyone heard of peer-to-peer car sharing? It's really cool. Instead of a company owning a bunch of cars that are scattered through a city in which you can have membership and use, and so you don't have to own a car, and that's what Zipcar is. Peer-to-peer car sharing is simply a technology platform that allows people to rent their car to whoever they would like to. And so it creates a whole new, it basically takes cars that mostly sit around for the majority of the day that are quite expensive to operate and run, and they make them available to others so that you can have a new source of income to help pay for your car. And in San Francisco, where 2 of the companies exist, the 2 largest companies in the world, one's called Get Around, the other is Relay Rides. And these are backed by major car companies, major insurance companies. This is a big deal in the industry. There's 3,000 cars in 6 months that have signed up in the Bay Area. There's not 3,000 cars in all of Zipcar's U.S. operations. So in three months, there's such a demand for this in cities where people have assets. They have a car, housing, they have tools they want to share. What's the platform to get those things out into the marketplace and create revenue streams for people? So peer-to-peer car sharing, you'll start to hear about it. It's going to be kind of, I think, a way that our cities are revolutionized so that you don't have to, not everyone has to own a car, but you'll have plenty of cars to borrow and rent in your neighborhood because your neighbors will be putting their cars up for that. And then we just, we take great care in creating an urban realm that blends, blends sort of sidewalks into transit and puts cars and transit and cycling together. And this is very intentional to create a nicer quality of urban environment in Portland. I mentioned cycling. We built 390 miles of cycle lanes. They're quite simple. They tend to be just painted lines in the right-of-way. But now we have the highest cycling rates in the U.S. About 10% of all commuters to downtown come by bike now. And 5 years ago, it was like 2 or 3%. So there's a huge movement towards people on their bikes because the infrastructure has just gotten to the point where people feel safe. There's a culture of it. You see this kind of traffic jam every day. People feel more comfortable cycling. They can be packed in essence. And like I mentioned, it's created a very vibrant cycle economy as well. And finally, we've invested in green infrastructure. We were successfully sued, the city was successfully sued about 15 years ago by environmental activists that argued that we were out of compliance with the Clean Water Act of the U.S. It turned out we were, and the city wasn't doing anything about it. So environmental activists sued the city. The city then was forced to build a bunch of new infrastructure to clean up our rivers, both the Columbia and the Atlantic. Much of that investment went into a $1.4 billion pipe, what we call the Big Dig, which was putting massive pipes on both sides of the river to collect the stormwater. We have combined sewer overflows in Portland, which is a very common system in the U.S. that your sewage and your stormwater are combined into a single pipe. They get treated at the wastewater treatment facility, but whenever you have major rain events, it all goes into the river because it spills over. The system is at capacity and they're released into the river. These new pipes now collect all that excess capacity. And even after $1.5 billion, which is a lot of money in the context for our city, it's at capacity. Just opened this year. The whole system's at capacity from the moment it opened. So we have to build green infrastructure. We need to infiltrate our water on site. We can't rely on gray infrastructure or underground pipe infrastructure. We now are moving towards sort of natural systems infrastructure to do much of the work. The cool thing, of course, is it creates a great urban realm. So you're doing a few things with this. You're creating nice environments. You're creating better pedestrian. And this is a very high-speed, very high-activity commute street. We're kind of traffic calming it with these infiltration. We're pulling the water off the streets and into these bioswales. And we're creating microhabitat, and we're reducing the amount of heat island effect. So we're doing a bunch of things with these products. We're helping create nicer conditions around parking areas. This is a really cool redevelopment of a historic building in which the parking is screened by native plants, and the water infiltrates down and is ultimately percolates into the soil, so it doesn't have to go into the stormwater system. It creates, really wonderful kind of urban design opportunities, and of course eco roofs, so it helps buildings create sort of a nicer condition on the roofs, and sort of new roof gardens and other things. So we've invested heavily in green infrastructure in Portland. And this is becoming what was, again, very avant-garde work from a very small group of cities and sort of eco warriors has become mainstream. So the city of Philadelphia, one of our large cities in the U.S., is now doing a plan for their whole city using green infrastructure. No pipes. It's all going to be done using green roofs, bioswales, other green infrastructure. The reordering, it's going to be part of their public realm process. major boulevard redevelopment, everything. So Philadelphia is going to probably, in the U.S. context, within 15 years, be one of the greenest cities because they're investing their stormwater taxpayer money into greening the land and the buildings versus putting pipes underground. And it also becomes part of our urban agriculture strategy. So I mentioned food is a major part. We're a growing region. We're one of the big growing regions in the West, in the Willamette Valley. And so what we do know about food, local food, is it obviously creates great community. There's a tremendous community gardening and food processing opportunity for low-income people and for all kinds of folks. It also has a tremendous value on carbon emission reductions. You can see down here we all like to eat red meat. Red meat's about double the carbon intensity of dairy. And even chicken, fish, and eggs has got about a third of the total carbon intensity of red meat. So having a local food strategy not only creates less food insecurity, particularly around low-income people who have a hard time making ends meet, but it also creates a carbon mitigation strategy and economic development strategy for the city as well. And over time, it's created, it's paid dividends. This is Vancouver, BC, and Portland showing sort of the impacts of smart growth policy over the years. You can see that the orange color that getting more intense, that's the high density neighborhoods that have over 12 people per acre. Vancouver is a much more dense city than Portland. Vancouver is one of the incredible examples in North America of how you start to put high-density housing and commercial together. The downtown of Vancouver, which is just this small portion of the city of Vancouver is roughly here. This is the whole metro region of Vancouver. Here, remind me, 90,000 people living there, or 90,000? 50? So the last 15 years, we put 50,000 more people in a very small amount of land in Vancouver. In Portland, it's much more modest, but we put most of the growth into the transit-oriented development and in the city itself. This is how it helped us reduce our overall carbon emissions in Portland. This is from 1990 levels. We're the only city in the U.S. When you control for economic downturn, because the economic downturn has really mitigated a lot of carbon emissions just because the industrial production is down, consumption is down. But we're the only city in the U.S. that's actually reduced our carbon emissions. So we're proving during a time when we grew our economy by 60%. So again, the mythology about carbon emission reductions slows or cripples an economy is nonsense. We grew by 60% in the 1990s. We reduced our carbon emissions by 22% per capita. We're down now below Kyoto. But of course, it doesn't mean anything because this is where we need to go. This is what the science is telling us. We all need to have a much smaller carbon footprint globally, particularly as the emerging economies really rapidly expand. In the U.S., we need to have a much, we're one of the most carbon-intense countries in the world, China being another one, but per capita, Canada and the U.S. are some of the most carbon-intense countries in the world, save some of our friends in the Middle East that burn oil for everything. So the good news is that we can do it, but the bad news is that the scale in which we have to act is so much greater than what we've been able to do today. And this is consistent globally as well, as far as the real modest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, so Portland has roughly 12 tons per capita, carbon emissions, 12 tons per person. In Vancouver, I believe it's 9, is it maybe even lower? It's 8 or 9, which is pretty good because Vancouver, as dense as it is, it's still it's a North American city. There's car ownership and there's sprawl and other sort of factors. In Tokyo and Germany and Copenhagen, it's more like 4 tons per capita. So we're still, 3 to 4 times what some of the most livable, most expensive, most affluent cities in the world do for carbon emissions. So the good news is that we can hit these goals and not reduce our overall economic.
Data for Mexico?
I don't have data from Mexico, but we'll look it up. You want mine? No. All right. Look up Mexico City carbon emissions per capita. So when you break down carbon emissions, and this is fairly consistent globally, particularly for cities, is buildings are a tremendous amount of that emissions. Now, in New York City, it's about 80% of the emissions come from buildings because the transportation system is pretty efficient. Most people commute by transit. In cities like Portland, very common Western cities, the majority of the people are still commuting by car. A lot of them are still commuting by single occupancy vehicles. So you have a bigger slice of transportation. But what we know in the U.S. is the building stock is a real opportunity, and Mexico City is no different. I imagine that your building stock is a higher percentage of overall emissions to transportation, and probably given the amount of growth and how big your city is and how dependent people are on commuting into the city. I imagine your transportation is quite large. This helps us get a roadmap for what we want to do around emissions, and again, developing kind of a green city strategy. So we've modeled in Portland our about 15 tons per capita in 1990. In 2008, we're down to 12. By 2030, we need to be down by about 5.5 tons. And by 2050, we need to be under 2 tons per capita. Now, that sounds pretty daunting, but if you break it down by sector, by electricity usage in miles per day, of commuting per day, right now our commuting is around 18 miles on average. 18 miles is, what is that? That's about 30 kilometers per day. So it's pretty large. But now in the U.S., it's about 20. The average city is about 24 miles of average commute distance. That's been the major impact of sprawl in the U.S. You drive tremendous distance to get to work, and a lot of times you're spending an hour. I know it's very consistent here in Mexico City as well. You spend an hour, 2 hours in traffic. It's what economic productivity for a city. Not to mention, we're all getting fatter and we're all getting unhappier by doing that kind of commuting. But what it means, though, in the U.S., in Portland, in the context is by 2030, we need to get that down to 13 miles, and by 2050 down to 7 miles. So that's not a huge leap of faith to think that we can't carve another 10 miles of average commute time. Yeah, that just means we got to build housing close to our jobs, which is within our reach. It's not we've got 40 years to do it. So as you look at the trends, you can see that as so daunting as that is, the ability to make strong land use transportation connections, given we've also already making investments, feels more doable. And then electricity use, right now we use about 12,000 kilowatt per hours per capita. We need to bring that down to 4,000. Well, with green energy, with renewables, with wind, investments that our utilities are making by making our buildings more efficient, this is a very doable number. I mean, very affordably done. So the good news is making our buildings more efficient and linking transportation to closer to jobs and housing, we're going to be able to meet these emissions. We might all be burning up in a plant that we can't live in by then, but we certainly know that these investments create more livable cities, regardless of carbon emissions. And that's what cities like Toronto, or Vancouver, and Tokyo, and Copenhagen, they're all living in these realities today. They're already, they're driving much less. They're commuting by transit. They're taking bicycles. They've got much less energy-intensive industry and buildings. And something that's really was sort of powerful when you add this up as far as an economic sort of story in Portland. We did a very well-known economist did a study basically saying that we drive 4 miles less than the average American in Portland. So we drive 18 miles versus 22 miles. Doesn't seem like a lot, does it? 4 miles. That means, but that for our population, that's 8 million fewer miles driven per day in Portland. At 20 miles per gallon, that's 400,000 gallons of gas per day saved for those 4 miles. That's 1.5 million tons of carbon not emitted for those 4 miles per year. And that's $1.2 billion US in avoided costs every year by driving 4 less miles every year than the American average. So imagine That number, if you're driving 2x that, 3x that, you're going to put billions of dollars back in the local economy. All this money in Oregon, my home state, goes out to the oil companies in Texas, it goes out to the overseas oil companies. It's a colossal waste of money. It does nothing for our local economy. The only people that make money in Oregon and Portland off of petro are gas stations and distribution. That's all. You can name the number of people in that industry, 1.2 billion a year, on two hands. I'm sorry, there's probably 100 gas stations in Portland. I mean, it's just such a small part of the economy, and it sucks a huge percentage of our economic sort of activity right out of the region. So this is really important to sort of add up the economics of green cities. We're working with Sir Nicholas Stern, who's a British economist. He authored a very important but totally ignored paper that basically said that for us to totally reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally, we would have to spend 1% of total GDP of the world. So this would mean that every country would have to spend about 1% of gross national product to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we would meet our goals for the IPCC scientists have been telling us to totally get down to what we need by 2050. And so he's doing a study with us in a bunch of cities, trying to monetize the impacts of green investments so that we have a much better understanding of the overall economic impacts of green policies, transit investments, natural area protection, building efficiency, all of the activities that I was just sort of highlighting in Portland that are going on all over the world, so we can have a better sense of the economic impacts that hopefully give us courage, our local politicians and our national politicians courage to double down on these investments and make this business as usual versus having to be kind of a strange avant-garde movement that many of the mainstream business interests think is kind of lacking. Well, it's fundamental to the growth, to the future of our cities. And so for what's next, building off of that is we have to build a very cogent and very powerful economic development strategy that links livability and smart growth. So all of you who work in real estate and design and planning, it's really trying to link these professions that have been around this work for some time around economic development. It's develop something called the green print for the regions. In essence, it's a layering of land use, transportation, green building activities on an economic development strategy. What we found was pretty fascinating. When you get into the data, our state is doing quite well in the green economy. We have the fastest growing clean energy sector in the country per capita. We have become a leader in energy efficiency. This is businesses that are in the business of doing energy efficiency programs for utilities, have technologies that they're putting into buildings. We have the largest concentration of workforce in the clean energy sector in the U.S. We had no idea because we hadn't created we never even articulated what a cluster around this industry meant. We were just going about our business. It turns out there's a clean tech cluster. It's renewables, it's energy efficiency, it's wind, it's smart grid, it's smart transportation. All of that is an economic part. It's a sector within the economy. It turns out all of our land use decisions and investments in transit actually have helped create this sector, and it's quite large. And that our clean energy jobs have expanded at an average of 4.8% a year compared to an average of 1% for the other sectors. We never thought to promote this, and so now we've turned this around, and now this is one of our major growth areas. And so we've created a strategy around electric vehicles, energy efficiency, green development, solar manufacturing, and wind energy to become the sort of backbone of this cluster strategy. And so far, so good. We've now become the largest producer of solar photovoltaics in North America. We now manufacture more PVs than any other part of both Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. combined. We are home to the two largest wind companies in the world, Vestas, with the North American headquarters for Vestas, and Iberdrola, which is the largest European wind development company in their North American headquarters. And so with that becomes, again, a layering strategy for cities to think. Don't think of doing urban design and development sort of separate from doing economic development. There's a clear correlation in developing it, and you can create a supply and demand strategy around this. So for our framework, we in essence said we want to build a regional market for clean and green products, and we want to grow the regional base of clean and green products. And so we created a strategy of basically supply and demand strategies. We're trying to create more supply, so that's just creating more economic production or manufacturing and the goods and services that are created around the green economy. But we also have to create a demand for these things. So we need to create resource-efficient strategies and requirements for our buildings. If we make our buildings, if we, as a municipality or a group of municipalities, require stringent energy efficiency standards, that creates jobs, that creates new technologies. That means you can connect your manufacturers of solar photovoltaics and energy efficiency equipment into that policy making, and on and on. So this is a new strategy we've created. It includes financing, and it includes some very simple metrics of success. Have you created more jobs? Have you reduced greenhouse gas emissions? Have you increased overall energy savings, like that green dividend analysis I showed you? And have you expanded business opportunities? So we're trying to keep the metrics quite simple, but for the first time, we're linking all this sort of early green activity that started with land use into a strategy that is focused on economic development. And this is a big business, and this is just a small sort of showing of major initiatives globally around the green cities movement. So this is you probably know this, but this is not some small activity happening. When the 40 mayors of the 40 largest cities get together and are jockeying for what they're doing to compete against other cities, things have changed. I mean, this stuff was so, not talked about 10 years ago. Now all the mayors are talking about how many bike lanes they have, and how many buildings they're retrofitting, and how much public plazas they're putting back into the public realm and taking away from cars. The city of Shanghai, 5 years ago, the Minister of Transportation was proudly promoting their goals of reducing the amount of bicycle mode split. They were basically trying to, because historically that city was, many people got around by bicycles. They were clearing out the bicycle infrastructure for highways, and they were very proud about that. They said, we're going to reduce the amount of bicycle down to 10% by 2020, and we're going to have more automobiles. They've totally reversed course. So in just 10 years, this has gone from being a very avant-garde movement to becoming totally mainstream. And the reasons are pretty obvious. I mean, cities that don't do this are going to be screwed. We see this with oil shock. We see this with climate change. We see it with pollution. If we don't create more livable cities and less energy-intensive cities, we're going to be at a global disadvantage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our green building work, and then we're going to talk about eco-districts. So I'll probably take a break after green building, so we can all go to the restroom and chat amongst ourselves. But I thought it important because green building, again, this theme of sort of, kind of what was viewed as an outlier activity has now become mainstream. I don't know how many of you have been involved in a green building in Mexico City? Okay, so it's growing. And how many of you want to be involved in a green building? You're interested. How many of you think it's a bunch of bullshit? How many think that it's just stupid? The green building is not a trend of the future. Good. That's good. So it's a coming trend in Mexico City. I'm sure I know there's the Mexico Green Building Council, and I know there's advocacy around it. I noticed we were walking Reforma yesterday. There's a big sign for a LEED building, one of the new high rises being built. So it's clearly a trend that's becoming serious market penetration. There's some very interesting work that was done a few years ago by an architect and an advocate named Ed Mazaria, and he started something called Architecture 2030. Have you heard of Architecture 2030? Yeah, hands who've heard of it. So Architecture 2030 was an idea that we needed our buildings to become carbon neutral by 2030. And this was based on, kind of an environmental agenda meeting a sort of a design agenda. And Ed is a very impassioned, very smart architect, and he started to develop a strategy. And what was really interesting, just to kind of frame the issue, in the US, we now have, this is a couple of years ago, but we have 250 billion square feet of building stock in the US. By 2030, a portion of that's going to be demolished. This is following historic trends. You know, we just tear down X amount of square footage every year. There's data on this. The remaining 200, so we demolish about 50 billion. The expected, the trends would be by 2030 we demolish 50 billion square feet. The remaining 200 billion square feet, of that, 150 billion will be renovated, again, following historic trends. And then we would create roughly 200 billion more of new development in the US. So by 30 years, by 2030, in 20 years, we will have rehabilitated and built almost the country again. Our buildings, with the small exception of about 50 billion square feet, everything in the US will have been rehabilitated at least once, or it's brand new. And so this we have to get right. You know, we have to get this right. And so his position is we need to get towards carbon neutrality. We need to have highly efficient net zero buildings, or we're not going to meet our Kyoto Protocol goals. Because what's happening here is if you're building 200 billion square feet of new buildings, you're just adding to your emissions portfolio in a major way. So you better be squeezing your whole damn thing down very quickly, or we're going to be having runaway sort of emissions problems. And the buildings in the U.S. are responsible for about 75% of the power needs in the U.S. So the buildings are where the action is, again, to a certain extent, as it relates to carbon emissions. And the good news is that if you've seen this is some work that McKinsey, the major international consultant firm, did for the C40, for the Clinton Foundation, folks I used to work for. And they modeled all the different kind of interventions, what they call abatement sort of tactics, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Everything under this line are free, meaning there's a payback. It's a pretty quick payback. If it's over here, it's a very quick payback. And then these things actually cost over time. But a majority of the building-related activities, retrofit activities, are all very affordable to do. So why aren't we doing them? If there's a great payback, if there's a good return on investment, why aren't we doing that? And that's sort of been the question that's been posed in the building retrofit movement for the last 5 years of getting rational with investors, commodity real estate folks, property management companies, new developers, to get them to develop strategies to do scalable retrofit. And there's a pretty well-known sort of curve of technological advancement. This has been proven out in a variety of technologies and a variety of industries that innovation. The innovators come first, and the saturation and the maturity of the markets come last. And in that, there's a series of activities that need to happen to promote, whether it's a single building in the form of being a green building, to having every building that's ever done by any major developer by de facto be green, maybe 20 to 50 or 60% energy efficient. To get there, you need an education program. It starts in the universities, it starts with the trade associations, it starts with the utilities. Then you need to create pricing schemes, incentives. You need to have voluntary measures, and then ultimately you have to regulate it. And as the market pressure drives up, you run the risk of flaming out if you don't crank up the regs and the pricing signals early enough. You could just have a movement that never really goes anywhere. And we saw this with the first generation of green buildings in the United States in the 1970s. When Ronald Reagan came in and became our president, he gutted every incentive, every research initiative that was being done at the Federal Department of Energy, within our labs, within the universities, and we lost 20 years of innovation around solar, around renewables, and around energy efficiency. So we took a large step backwards in the late 1970s, where countries like Sweden, that was the most oil-dependent country in the world, continued to invest. And now Sweden's the least oil-dependent country in the world, with some of the highest quality of life, some of the lowest carbon emissions. and they're some of the most diverse from an energy perspective countries in the world, because they just simply invested when countries like the U.S. disinvested. And so I think with green buildings, we could run the risk of doing the same thing if we don't create a pathway of innovation that leads to acceptance that's rational and consistent over time. So some examples. In Portland, I started the green building program in 1999. And again, we were like a band of wacky people. This was this was pre-LEED. This was sort of, there was a lot of resistance in the development industry. But we got a lucky break. And our lucky break, and I think every city has the opportunity to have a lucky break, is a major developer, one of our biggest, got into it. And this is the brewery blocks. I showed a photo of it. 5 block, one of the biggest development projects of that time in Portland, in which we created a housing, a mixed income rental unit property, a grocery store with an energy plant on top of it. A historic. This is an old brewery, the Weinhardt Brewery in Portland, one of the iconic breweries of the U.S. That was shuttered and bought and commoditized and went elsewhere and makes crappy beer somewhere else. And a developer bought this property, which was mostly manufacturing for beer making, and repurposed it. This is a commercial building. This is a historic brew house, and then a new building, commercial as well. All grounds, ground retail. One of the real success stories in Portland, and it's spurned now over $4 billion of new development in that neighborhood alone. Streetcar runs through the neighborhood. This is a major arterial. This cuts our city north to south. This neighborhood now which was a very low income, very seedy part of town, is now being gentrified and new investment coming in that neighborhood. They decided to go green, and LEED had just been created. We worked with them on an incentive program. We created a tax incentive at the state that they took advantage of. They did careful demolition. They repurposed a bunch of the old brewery equipment, and the bricks and the concrete were repurposed. And they built a really lovely project that instantly created legitimacy for green building in our city. This was a major investor, New York investment money. This was major pension dollars and major large global finance investment banks were part of this project. So this was not this was not philanthropy. This was a market project. You can see here, this is just this is the grocery store. This is a little historic facade that was saved, and then the new building kind of built within it. And it has this district cooling facility that was built for the project but oversized so that it could serve the rest of the neighborhood over time. If we've gone on to do historic preservation, this is a LEED Platinum building that's currently under construction. That's going to be Vestas North American headquarters, the wind industry company. We're investing in our universities. This is a local community college. This is also a LEED Platinum building. This is in the suburbs. This is a rainwater harvesting. This is to sort of showcase the amount of rain that's been. It's a public art installation to showcase how much rain they've collected and how much is being reused for toilet flushing. This was a major investment of our largest employer in the city. It's the Health and Sciences University. It's a teaching college. It's medical. It's a hospital, medical, dental, multidisciplinary. They do some very advanced cancer research. They built a new building that's a LEED Platinum building, 60% more efficient than our code. And our code is quite good, actually, in Oregon. Done at market rates. They took advantage of the tax credit, but they did it as a rational real estate deal. This was now, again, a philanthropy movement. And it sits right next to one of the more unique, I don't have a good photo of it. You'll see a photo of it in the film I show. But we built a tram because this university was built up on a hill, and now they're building their second campus down on the river in that polluted area I showed you. That's going to be their major second campus. And they needed a transportation link between the hills, so they built a tram. It was part of an international design competition. We're restoring parts of Portland State University, our largest public institution, which serves about 35,000 students. I heard that your public university, how many students in the large public university?
300,000 around.
How many?
300,000.
300,000 students. There's 5,000 architecture students, I heard. I mean, that's just, you guys do it big here in Mexico State. It was incredible. Anyway, this is just it's an okay, but it's some of the historic fabric of this Portland State University LEED Platinum building. So these guys are figuring out how to do LEED Platinum, 50% energy savings to code in, existing historic buildings. And we're building some pretty cool new stuff. This is actually a federal building. This is this building. If you saw the before image, which I couldn't find, it's like the ugliest, prototypical kind of federal building we have. They were built. I think this particular building, 17 stories. They built over 300 of them throughout the U.S. They just a cookie cutter building. They put them all in a bunch of cities. They were typical federal agency buildings. Well, they decided, because of Portland's kind of green building innovation, decided to test their next generation advanced buildings. So they've gutted this building down to the stud. So right now it's simply it's just down to the steel, the original steel. Took all the facade, and they're going to test this active facade. This is west facing. Of course, if you know your architects, you know that the west is the most difficult to control, particularly in corporate high rises. So this is going to be a green wall that helps create both transparency, but also helps shade, reduce cooling, a large photovoltaic array, and then every facade is a little different, tuned to the sort of dynamics of that side. So the south facade will have active photovoltaics and light shelves. The north and east will have very little because they don't need as much. And this building that just came online, the private sector's gotten quite active. And so it started with the private sector, moved into the public sector, back to the private sector. This is a new, again, a LEED Platinum building. This is the first building in the U.S. to incorporate wind energy in the top, a very advanced facade, triple glazed facade. And it's a very fun building because they've really done integration quite well. Again, another market project, not subsidized, not a philanthropy project. They're managing rainwater, so they're collecting the rainwater and flushing it from their toilets. They're managing that water through an eco-roof strategy at 2 levels. They've created a gray water recycling system, so they're managing that rainwater that comes in, goes to toilets, then gets treated as gray water, back again into the toilets. And then we have both solar thermal to preheat water and wind. The wind energy hardly produces any power for the building. It's totally a demonstration. But it's been great. This building is a large architecture firm's building. So it's a mixed-use apartments and commercial. And the large architecture firm, ZGF Architects, now are getting commissions all over the world because they took a crazy idea and put wind turbines on top of the building. And now we're studying this to understand how serious can you actually take wind in an urban setting. And so the National Renewable Energy Lab is studying this. The City of San Francisco is doing probably the most rigorous analysis of urban wind opportunities. We've already studied solar. We have a pretty good idea of how much solar energy you can put in cities, but wind is a pretty new issue because of the microclimates and because wind is obviously very sensitive to the building, the building stock and what it does to create a lot of inconsistencies. So there's a business case for green building. What started, as kind of a wacky idea, this mainstream developer picked up on it. Now we've been able to study the economic returns on investment on these buildings. We have over 130 LEED-rated buildings in Portland, so there's a lot of buildings to choose from to understand how they're performing from an environmental perspective, how they're performing from a tenant health and productivity and sort of lifestyle perspective, and how they're working from a pure economic development perspective, real estate perspective. What we found is about 0 to 2% of investments, of increased investment, has resulted in an average of a 20% life cycle savings. And they all have higher net operating income of roughly about 50 cents per square foot. We were able to look at employee productivity in a few buildings, and that's really where the money savings becomes very significant. And if you, as real estate, holders of real estate, if you can prove you've got buildings that are healthier, that productivity is improved, sick days are reduced, that becomes a competitive advantage for your building. And that's what we've seen in some of our buildings that we've selectively analyzed the health benefits. So there is a mainstream belief in Portland and a lot through the U.S. now with the help of the U.S. Green Building Council that green buildings are the best buildings on the market. That's just, if you want to be, you want to be a smart investor, whether it's you invest as a REIT investor or a major property investor, or you're a developer that is a sophisticated developer, you don't do anything but believe in the building and pay attention to the details of the indoor air quality, the energy savings, the water strategies. Those are the buildings that are going to be the ones that are valued going forward. And probably the most important new development that's happening with buildings is this notion of creating kind of a miles per gallon in the U.S. context for buildings. Right now, we have no idea how our buildings function. We don't have any idea how they function compared to other commercial buildings or other residential buildings. I bought a house 2 years ago. I couldn't even ask for what the energy bills were on that house. So I was blind going into buying a house that I had no idea what my operations costs were. It turned out it was a really expensive house. And I've had to spend a bunch of money to reduce the overall energy impacts because the operational costs were so significant. That's ridiculous. I mean, we know more about other things about our buildings. The fact that you don't know what your energy footprint or your carbon footprint or your water footprint of the building is ridiculous. So this is a big movement internationally to create rating systems for buildings in which they're scored against very simple metrics. And then you have to, in some cities, in New York City, for instance, San Francisco, London, through the EU, they're requiring energy performance in buildings. In the U.S., and I don't know what it's like in Mexico, but I assume it could be quite similar. If you get an issuance of occupancy for the building, you're done. And the inspectors go back and look at elevators and life safety and sprinklers, but that's it. They're only interested in life safety if there's a fire in the building. People egress, we don't think about energy as an important sort of benefit or an important issue societally. We don't think of it as a thing that makes sense from a cost perspective, from an energy savings and an energy resiliency perspective. Well, that's changing. Now, I think you'll see, certainly in the U.S., which from a regulatory perspective, we'll probably be one of the last to actually regulate ourselves on this. But it's happening at the cities. So in the city of Portland, we're looking at energy disclosure as a start and then energy performance requirement as a secondary measure. So while the federal government might not take it on in the U.S. or states, the cities will. So New York City went, San Francisco, Seattle, and it's quite interesting because, again, there's no appetite for this at our federal level. So does it make sense to take a break for a few minutes? You can stretch your legs, and we can come back and talk a little bit about a really cool project we're doing in the League. And I want to introduce Darren Dinsmore. So Darren's with me. And then you're going to be in the workshop with us tomorrow? Yep. Great. So Darren has a really cool company called CrowdBright that uses social media and something called crowdsourcing. Anyone familiar with crowdsourcing? Darren, maybe you can explain it. But uses technology to help create really vibrant, kind of interactive planning processes, design processes. So Darren's been kind enough to join me on this trip, and we're gonna work with it tomorrow. But I don't know if you want to say a few words. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about it after.